Okay, well, welcome to our ChatterStars Ways with Poetry webinar. What I want to do in the next 20-25 minutes is just to share with you a range of activities and ideas behind how we can use poetry to boost vocabulary, which is what we at ChatterStars are all about, to try and build that eloquent, brave, world-changing voice for our young people that's going to really make the difference for them when they are in education at the different points of examination, but most crucially, when they make their way into the world and have all sorts of opportunities in front of them. The right vocabulary, the right way to express ourselves will really make all the difference. So I want to share with you two things about vocabulary across the curriculum, or that could be read as two things about vocabulary across family life. And there are 2 points that research tells us are particularly useful to bear in mind. Actually, there are quite a few more, but these are 2 of probably the most salient aspects to vocabulary learning. The first is that we should make it a really distinct area in the curriculum, or be really mindful of it as a distinct area in our family talk and discussion. And that's because it bears repeating and it bears the emphasis of really understanding why we choose the words we do and why we pick up on trying to improve and up-level the kind of words that we're choosing to use, finding the right noun, finding the exact right meaning of the word we want to express ourselves with around nuance, and making sure we've got the right meaning in our connotation. The second is to raise word consciousness. And there's a whole raft of research behind that. But to play with words through all of those different ideas around games and song and humour is really valuable in embedding vocabulary and making that really rich, word-rich learning environment, whether that's at school or at home or wherever you are, in the car, on holiday, it doesn't matter. Raising word consciousness and being aware of the words we choose and use is a really valuable activity. And that's why poetry really is a fabulous tool, part of our toolkit, to allow us to play with words, to play with vocabulary through poetry and through other activities around song and lyrics and that kind of idea. Okay, we've got people in the waiting lobby, so I hope that my colleagues are able to let them in. If there's any problem, my colleagues, could you just text me, because that's the easiest way for me to see what's happening. Okay. Jason Reynolds is a very prolific author and writes incredible novels for teenagers, young adult fiction. And he had an opportunity to talk on American TV not long ago, and my colleague's going to share a link with you in the chat box so that you can access that. It's around what is a poem, what is poetry. Let me just try and let those people in, because it seems that we can't let them in. Let me just admit everybody. Okay, welcome if you've just joined us. I was hopeful that you would just be able to come straight in, but I'm not sure that happened. Anyway, I hope that you can hear and see us now. Let me just check with my colleagues. Can you still see my screen share? Because that wasn't working last time. So let's just check. You can still see my screen share. Hopefully my colleagues would just let me know. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Liz. So Jason Reynolds has this brilliant extract on American television where he talks about poetry, and my colleague's going to share that link in the chat box so you can watch that in your own time. But what he talks about is that poetry is the puppy in the hand. Poetry is the puppy in the hand of children who are frightened of reading. They are frightened of words and too much text. Then poetry is that little safe puppy in the hand. And the reason he says this is because poetry has an ability to create entire moments with just a few choice words. I always think that poetry is the cordial of language. It's the most distilled version of language that we can possibly use to create meaning. And for young people who might be a bit put off by too much text, poetry, in terms of building vocabulary, is about the most wonderful part of our toolkit that we can use. So for those bibliophobia children who really find text a bit overwhelming, or are just learning and starting that journey with learning about vocabulary and learning about reading and the love of story in particular, poetry is a great place to start. Jason Reynolds argues that the spacing and the line breaks create that natural rhythm and musicality that we really want to build into a fluent reader. We call it prosody, that idea of reading fluently and alternating your voice and your pitch and your rhythm, and poetry really lends itself to that. And that's something that Poetry by Heart are going to share with us later on in this webinar. Stanzas, each chunk of poetry, each stanza gives us a bite-sized chunk at a time. And the white space for an intimidated reader, Jason Reynolds tells us, adds a real breathability to something that can seem a bit overwhelming. So poetry is a really lovely place to start at whatever level you are, when you're looking for the best kinds of vocabulary, because it is that most distilled version of language that creates meaning. And here's a lovely place to go, if you haven't come across it, to find some really choice poetry. The Lost Words by Robert Macfarlane and Jackie Morris is a beautiful collection of small and some longer poems, all around the words that have been lost from our vocabulary in many ways. Some of them that children aren't able to articulate now because they're not as frequently in their eye line, perhaps. Things like bramble, kingfisher, willow, acorn, and all of those words from the natural world Robert Macfarlane has turned into poetry. And there are some Lost Words resources for Key Stage 2 and 3, and there's a little link there on the web on this PowerPoint, which we will share with you if you've registered for the webinar, so you can have a look at that in your own time. But that book, Lost Words, is a real treasure trove of poetry. And there's one very short version of one of his poems from the book there about ivy. And that really personifies what I wanted to say about it, language being its most distilled version. So this poem is really short, but let's hear how much meaning is conveyed in this short poem. Ivy. I am ivy, a real high flyer. Via bark and stone, I scale tree and spire. You call me ground cover. I say sky wire. So that's a whole heap of meaning in just a very, very few words. And we can unpick and think about what meaning is conveyed there through metaphor, through imagery, through personification of ivy, bringing it to life and making it feel as if it's a real person, a real high flyer. So there's all sorts that we can take from poetry, and memorising poetry, and this is something that Poetry by Heart will share shortly, is really a great way of turning on our language capability and of embedding vocabulary into our own register, our own specific word choices. And short little poems like that are very easy to memorise. That's a great fun activity to do at school. It's great fun to do it at home. You know, give your kids a challenge that if they can memorise that in an hour, then they get a little, you know, extra bit of milkshake, whatever it might be. Maybe see if they can remember it this time next week, this time next month. And it begins to embed and turns into that real internalized rhythm and the patterns of the English language. And they become part of their own language store. So they are adopted into a child's own register, their own language store, a whole new set of language patterns. So memorising poetry, short little snippets like this one about the ivy, great activity. If you joined me last time on our first webinar, then you'll have seen us talk about calligrams before, but we know from Dr. Jessie Ricketts' research, who works at Royal Holloway in London, that visually attractive ways of capturing words is a really powerful way to make sure that they live long in our memory and to embed them in our own word language stores. So calligrams is a good way of doing that. We can do that around images where we put all sorts of different terms for rain in the pattern of an umbrella. We can do that with just one word, as in shark, and making it look like a shark. So depending on your age and stage, there's something that calligrams have to offer for you there. And if you look at our first webinar, we say a little bit more about it in that one. Fast poetry. A fast poem is a lovely way of embedding all sorts of different skills for our children. In terms of grammar, it's a great, easy little win for teaching grammar, because a fast poem is, as you see it on this slide, it is 1 noun, 2 adjectives, 3 adverbs, and 4 verbs. And it creates a really lovely little nugget of meaning around the noun choice that you've made. So in this instance, it's spaghetti. So we've got here spaghetti, thin and soft, silently, slowly, easily, slipping, sliding, slithering, disappearing. 2 adjectives, 3 adverbs, 4 verbs. And you'll see a few more here that I've done with some teachers actually in the past. We did a little brainstorm around what we'd like to use these for. And let's have a look at tea, because we all like a cup of tea. Tea, hot and smooth, soothingly, calmly, carefully, relaxing, quenching, warming, awakening. Great vocabulary builder, great bit of grammar support for, especially at Key Stage 2, where there's so much grammar they need to understand and retain. And great for playing around with language. And of course, the noun doesn't have to be a concrete noun. We can have abstract nouns like fear, hope, and we can play around with language, but we've got really clear rules and a structure to follow, which sometimes makes choosing the right word a little bit easier. And again, these could be memorized. It's a great way of boosting vocabulary, looking at fast poetry. Blackout poetry, or some people call it found poetry, is a really lovely activity for all sorts of reasons. It can be visually really striking, as you can see here, but also it's a really lovely way for those people who might be a bit short of ideas. They might say, oh, I can't think of anything, I can't write a poem, I've got no idea. Because in a blackout poem, you give your child the text. You give them a little cutout snippet of a newspaper, or if you've got old books. I know when I had my English team in my school, we had a big cupboard full of books that nobody used anymore. And I wish we'd done a lot more of this. So find old books, old newspapers, cut out the text, and it's all there. And then all you have to do is get rid of the words that you don't want. And suddenly what comes out of the page is a poem. So in this instance, somebody has obviously found the word tide, so it's a good idea to find one word in particular that you think might set the tone or the narrative or the story behind what it is you want to say. And then they've drawn this very simple but beautiful and very striking wave and pulled out the words that make something really interesting. He felt comfortable as he floated to the sudden tide of the room. And it's really random, but there's a really interesting word choice going on behind blackout poetry. So have a look at what you've got around at home, at school, wherever you are, and how you might be able to use that. Make some great displays. You know, it might be a really lovely idea to do for Christmas cards. You know, if you've got some I don't know, Charles Dickens, maybe, if you've got a Christmas Carol hanging around and you've got more than one copy and you don't mind chopping up a few, maybe you could do a bit of blackout poetry around that. For all sorts of real audiences make a big difference, don't they? If we're doing something and we know it's going to be looked at by somebody, like a Christmas card, that can be really powerful. And there's a few other examples of blackout poetry. It's great if you're in school, team up with your art department, see what you can come up with together. There's one for the Great Gatsby, which actually they've pulled out and made from that piece of text from the Great Gatsby. They've actually made something that summarises quite a lot of the plot. One autumn night, years before, they came to a place where the moonlight stopped and change was among the stars. Wow, that's quite deep in terms of what actually goes on in the Great Gatsby. There's a lot of meaning there that you can pull out. So it can be quite a nice summary activity, or something that you do as a revision activity as well, blackout poetry, depending on the piece of text you give your students. Okay. Kennings, we used to talk about kennings quite a lot in school, and they've sort of gone out of favour a little bit. I haven't heard many people using them recently, but they're a really lovely thing to revisit if you haven't looked at them for a while. And certainly at home, this is something that we might use to create nicknames, or to describe our pets, or, you know, all sorts of people that we know collectively. So kennings were originally from Old English or Old Norse, and in fact the Vikings felt that to know something you had to name it. Unless you could really name it specifically, you didn't know it. So to name something was a way of knowing something, and it comes from that time where they had real interesting names for each other. So here we've got, in a calligram format, we've got kennings: meat eater, keen fighter, great pouncer, loud roarer, and of course the imagery of the calligram helps us understand they're talking about a lion. But all of that really boosts vocabulary, really boosts our ability to pick out the words that layer underneath a particular noun like lion, and give us the content to hold on to when we're thinking about what it is to describe a particular animal or a particular trait. There's a few more here which are connected to Beowulf, and Beowulf is a very famous text. Most of us look at it at some time or other in the classroom, whether we're at primary or secondary. It works on all sorts of different levels, and the RFC used to do a lot of work around Beowulf. There's a few very frightening films that are out now around Beowulf, but it's one of the earliest, if not the earliest, English text. And here's some of the kennings that are used in Beowulf to describe those different characters. And it's a lovely way of building and boosting vocabulary, because it's essentially poetry in nugget form: poison breather, treasure minder, guardian of the hoard, corpse maker for Grendel. You know, that's so much meaning in just those two words. So have a look at what kennings can do for you at home or in the classroom, and how they can be used to really boost thinking behind description. That's what it can really bring to life, is that description of nouns in particular. Okay, so we're going to let Poetry by Heart have the last part of this webinar. They're one of our partners for all of the reasons I've just described. We're all about vocabulary and boosting a powerful voice, and poetry has a big part to play in that. And we've worked alongside Poetry by Heart now for about a year to 18 months. Very sadly, Tim, who's going to present these slides, has been called away, so isn't able to join us, but he's given me his slides, so I'm going to just talk them through with you and tell you a little bit about what it is Poetry by Heart do. So there's their taglines: choose a poem, learn it by heart, perform it out loud. And that really is the basis of what Poetry by Heart is all about. It is a free to enter national poetry speaking competition. And every year the finals are held at Shakespeare's Globe in London, and you can see some images there of young people performing their poetry on that incredible stage. What an opportunity that is. And Poetry by Heart encourage schools to take part. They have all sorts of free resources for teaching and learning about poetry, but it really is about learning a poem and reciting it by heart. And there's so much great opportunity for embedding a really rich vocabulary, a really rich language store in that activity. That's one of the reasons that we work closely together. So why do it? Well, a lot of the reasons I've just been talking about, as well as the fact it's seriously good fun, really enhances those speaking skills and confidence to perform, really boosts an enjoyment of poetry, and of course the opportunity to perform in front of other people is such a character building activity that will stay with young people for all of their lives. They will always remember those moments where they had to really take a deep breath and go and perform something that they'd memorised. Poetry by Heart have all sorts of supportive resources out there, not least of which is their brilliant website. So they have a timeline anthology that is divided by age. So depending on the age of your child, they've got activities and poetry that are relevant to their age and stage. So from The Owl and the Pussycat through to poetry about Jabberwocky, through to First World War poetry and sonnets from Shakespeare and the Romantics. There are all sorts of opportunities to explore poetry through their website, and that really underpins their competition to go and perform. And what schools do and what you can do at home is enter your young people, get them performance ready, help them with those activities, and Poetry by Heart have some ideas around how you can help them perform and be performance ready, and then enter into the competition. And then, in fact, I know that Tim was just recently going through with teachers all of the entrants which were recorded and sent as a video to choose who it was that was going to go through to the final. And the finals this year are on the 20th of June, and they always publish a little video on YouTube about how the final has gone with a few clips. So have a look out for that, because you'll see the sorts of things that they do. And they have some poets that go along and perform as well, and talk to the young people about poetry. And there's some reasons to learn it by heart and some ideas around how to do that. So see it, try writing it out. Move it, try making out movements and gestures that match the words in the poem, and that has a real helpful benefit for adding fluency to reading. And in fact, that's something that translates through to prose text as well as poetry. So that's something to have a look at. Listening to it, just listening back, and in fact on their website and the CLPE websites you can hear poets reading their own poetry. That's quite a useful activity to do. Watch videos of other performances that have happened and then speak it. Try reading it, just one line at a time. Practice, what does it sound like if I read it like this? Vary your pace, vary your timing. How can I change it? And then there it is, there's the globe where they end up if they're chosen as the finalists to go and present their poems on that incredible stage. So check out Poetry by Heart. They really do have a lot of ideas to offer around poetry, and all of those will really help when you're trying to build vocabulary for your children and for your schools. And this is a quote from Hafiz, who's a Persian poet from many, many years ago, 15th century, I think, but actually couldn't be truer today. The words you speak become the house you live in. And that really is true of where we are now, because it is so defining, the word choice that we make. And the more we can do to help our young people with those choices, the more likely they are to be successful in whatever it is that they choose. And certainly as they get to those exam points, because if they can say it, they can write it. So that's us. I'll stop the screen share. We might have some questions, so I'm really delighted to take any questions if you have any that you would like to ask. Let's see if I can see anybody. Let's try and unmute everybody. Hi, Uma. I think you joined us last time, didn't you?
Hi. Yeah,
Hello.
I did.
Hi,
And I
Uma.
really found that one interesting and this one too.
Oh, that's
Thank
great.
you.
I'm so glad. Thank you so much for joining us. That's great.
No, thank you for this. Thank you. It was really lovely, and I'm really going to look up poetry by art. And I'm really liked the idea of giving that confidence to children to perform. And like you said, it has a very positive, lasting effect on them. So good for their self-esteem, especially after the pandemic as well. So
Absolutely
really
right.
nice. I'm really looking forward to actually going and have a proper look on the website. Thank you for sharing that.
Great. You're very welcome. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Okay. Well, thank you, everybody. That's 7:30, so I will love and leave you, and this recording will be posted out, and we will share what we did. So that's wonderful. Thank you, everybody, and good night.